So in the 1970s, only 7 species of fish could be found in the Chicago River. And today, more than 80 species are documented across the system. And before the Town Reservoir Plan, officials estimated that sewage reached the river once every 3 days, which now only occurs a few times annually. These successes did not happen by accident, but rather reflect decades of investment, policy decision, scientific research, and on-the-ground work. Today's panel brings together perspectives across science, research, and policy to help us understand what fish recovery in the Chicago-Calumet River looks like in practice, what made it possible, and what it means for where to go next. Wow, that was so good. I'm joined by an excellent group of panelists today. And I'm going to start actually with Austin Happel, the Shed Aquarium. Austin holds a PhD in natural resources and environmental science from the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. Thank you, Margaret. He is a freshwater ecologist focused on the conservation, management, and restoration of urban and ecosystems, with an emphasis on supporting diverse and resilient fish communities. He is especially interested in investigating what benefits restoration activities, including Shed's floating island, the Chicago River's 12 Mile, provide below the surface and how these benefits can be amplified elsewhere. Central to his work is a collaborative approach that leverages partnerships and the creative use of large existing data sets to address new questions in urban ecology, aquatic biodiversity, and restoration planning. And next to Austin is John Quail. John is the Director of Policy and Conservation at Friends of the Chicago River and has worked for over 20 years at Friends to identify potential areas for restoration or habitat improvement. He coordinates Friends Restoration habitat strategy. He possesses an extensive knowledge of the natural geography of the watershed and has developed a good grounding in the human geography of the watershed, having developed many relationships and an understanding of the cultures of different agencies and municipalities over his tenure with Friends. He has a degree in environmental policy and behavior from the University of Michigan. And finally, we have Phil Willink. Phil is an aquatic scientist and received his PhD from the University of Michigan and then worked at the Field Museum, the Aquarium, and the Illinois Natural History Survey. He has served on numerous boards and committees related to aquatic conservation. He has conducted research in a dozen different countries as well as extensively throughout the Chicago region. His primary specialty is fishes, specifically how fish communities change over time and whether these changes are in response to natural or anthropogenic factors. This has resulted in projects on endangered species, invasive species, habitat restoration, and climate change. His professional focus has evolved into taking scientific research and making the leap to actionable conservation and management initiatives and policy. Thank you all for being here. We have a few moderated questions by moi before we move into audience questions. So first, to get us started, we will leave it open-ended and let you talk about your work and each of your efforts as it relates to fish recovery in the river system over the years. Austin, go ahead.
All right, now it's on, right? Can you hear me? I'm loud, so the microphone just makes me like scream. But yeah, thanks for the introduction. Austin Happel. You can't even hear me?
No, just close your mouth.
Even closer? I'm still loud, so you can still hear me. So even closer. So thanks for the introduction, Austin Happel, Shed Aquarium. I run a research program at Shed. Most people don't know of a lot of aquariums that do research programs, so I got one of those lucky positions, and my program focuses on urban freshwaters. I use the tagline that I try to understand how fish live in our cities and how we can make their lives a little better. My research uses the Chicago River as a study system, partly due to proximity, it's right here, partly due to it being so interesting. It's reversed, it's channelized, it's integrated into why Chicago's here and why Chicago is the large city it is. But then also the river itself has a lot of other organizations that are collecting data. And so how can I then work with those organizations to make that data useful? So I split my time between doing that, which is creating partnerships and kind of data parasitism of turning data into stories, but then also doing field work. Despite how I'm dressed today, most of the summer is out on the river doing things. And I try to fill in the gaps between what the data those organizations are collecting. So I worked with the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District to work with some of their historic data to see how fish communities have changed over time. Then we linked that with water quality changes, how water quality has changed, and how that's due to the way that wastewater is both managed and treated. And then I work with the state quite a bit, who has an extensive data set on what fish are where in the river, and we can link that to habitat variables. So we were able to link that to shoreline development and talk about how if a new development's coming in, we probably don't want to promote shoreline armoring, which is adding riprap or adding steel walls. Instead, we promote shoreline softening, because we see even within our river that biodiversity responds to that. And then the data that I collect, I go out and collect things on, say, where do we and don't we find fish, and what habitat variables relate to those, and where we see high biodiversity. So we'll collect larval fish, where are fish spawning, where are they not spawning, what's the differences that are causing that, where are and are not zooplankton. And lately we're having fish do that work for us. So we're actually tracking 200 individual fish 24/7, 365, even today when the water out there is near freezing. We're tracking where fish are going and what habitats do they prefer. That way we can then look at, these are the preferred habitats of these larval fish, these zooplankton, individual adults that we're tracking. Where are they not going? And how can we use that to then inform restoration projects? I guess, and finally, some of the data that we collect is on people. So we're looking at, where are people recreating? Where are potential barriers that allow them to recreate? And how can we then take that to, say, the River Ecology and Governance Task Force and be like, people really want to kayak in this area. The closest launch is across town. Is there a way that we can maybe promote putting in a kayak launch here, or fishing pole holders, or something to collect their fishing line when they're done? So helping to kind of gather that information, so then we can look at these urban rivers, not only here in Chicago, but elsewhere. What is promoting biodiversity? What is promoting recreation? And how can we help have thriving urban centers?
Okay, thank you, Austin. Let's see here.
I gotta put up some background photos of my talks. I'm not nearly as exciting as my other two panelists.
So I thought I'd answer this question in a couple different ways.
One of the ways that we work to restore all the fish habitat is through policy and advocacy coordination.
We bring in coordination a lot, so I'm glad Dexter brought that up.
Also, we do things like look at water quality standards and advocate for new water quality standards, look at permits in the city, whether it's sewage outflow permits or building permits, just really make sure that everybody is sticking to the Clean Water Act, essentially, and making sure the water is getting cleaner and better for people and the wildlife that uses it. Over time, this really changes the way that people experience, understand, and value the river, and that's something that we've seen in our work over time. Another thing that we do is we really push aquatic habitat innovations. When we started, that was pretty easy because no one else was really doing that. So anything was pushing aquatic habitat innovations. But it's gotten a lot more innovative and exciting over time. Things like our Chicago River Schools Network in Friends' younger days really let us build up data sets to show the river is as clean as it is by putting kids out there in the river, looking at macroinvertebrates, collecting water samples and things like that. We had a project called the Walk that, or the River Walk, that's another project. A project called the Fish Hotel that predated the River Walk that really was an innovative way to show how fish can survive in a real urban seawalled environment that provided the kind of things a hotel provides for people, a place for fish to rest, to eat, to hang out, meet other fish, those kind of things. And it's something that was preserved when the Riverwalk came online in the jetties. So it's something the city thought was valuable enough to really continue to work with us to this day on looking at those really innovative solutions. We did a project to put catfish nesting cavities in the Chicago River. At some point in this process, I was going to list all the partners for these projects, but I would just be sitting here saying partners' names during my entire time. So decided not to do that, but it's a long, long list. But the Chicago, the catfish nesting cavities, we put 400 of these cavities in the river system, primarily in the Calumet, the North Branch, and the North Shore Channel, that provide nesting habitat for Illinois native channel catfish, but also for other Illinois native fish and macroinvertebrates and little insects and things like that that live in the river. We worked really hard on dam removal. When we started, we had to call it dam modification because the people that owned dams weren't excited So we were just gonna modifying them by taking them out. And so we can say dam removal now. Dams were and still are huge limiting factors for fish to move throughout the system, and working with partners like the Shed and I'm not gonna lose partners, but lots of partners. We really realized that the fish in our system weren't able to access better habitat and better water quality areas because of some dams. We started small with what are called low head dams, where sometimes you didn't even know they were there, up in the upper north branch at the Tamil Dam and the Winnetka Road Dam. And then in 2018, it really culminated with the removal of the North Branch Dam, which was a big project and had a lot of partners and took a long time, but really provides access now so that fish can get, they make it through the locks, which is easier than you think sometimes for the fish, and get all the way up to the headwaters and the Schofield lagoons and access some of those areas they weren't able to access before. We also have done lots of habitat projects for sort of related creatures like ospreys and osprey nests and nesting turtle habitat. We found turtle habitat was really limited in the system by where they could nest. And that's something that we wanted to address. And with partners, we were able to address that. One thing I'll say about this picture here, or this pictures, every picture in this collage is from our system. So that mink that's kind of staring out there in the middle there is from the North Shore Channel, just yards away from McCormick Boulevard. So these are all your urban wildlife, neighbors here. And then finally, I just want to touch on coordination. It's something that's been said a lot, but without coordination, it would be hard for us to accomplish what we've accomplished over time. Friends isn't a huge organization. We don't have a huge budget. And what we've done, we've used partnerships and collaboration as a catalyst to get projects done. It kind of acts in a bunch of ways, but one, it gets momentum behind a project that makes it much more likely that it's going to be implemented in the future. So we don't want to do work that sits on someone's shelf. We're trying to do work that ends up in the river. And I look around the room and we have so many partners here today, but that's how you end up with really innovative solutions. In Chicago, is really pushing the envelope on urban habitat for fish, I feel like.
Hi, I'm Philip Willink. I'm going to be brief about this, thinking about how long I've been doing this sort of thing. It dawned on me that I've been collecting and surveying fish in the Chicago River for over 25 years, which seems like a long time. I've also surveyed fish across Illinois, Indiana, Wisconsin, Michigan, Great Lakes, and other areas as well. So a lot of fish surveys, which is where it all sort of starts. Projects sort of bounce around. I could give you a 40-minute lecture on one of these. I'm not going to do that, but I've studied endangered species within the Chicago River. Sometimes there's invasive species projects, habitat restoration, mitigation, and sometimes it's just education outreach, like bringing school kids out and sending through the water and exploring what's all there. If you're going to look for a common theme for what a lot of these projects have, it would be looking to see what particular species we find in a particular area. And then if you understand the ecology of those particular species, they tell you a tremendous amount about the health of that system and how that system functions. And so that is a lot of what I do. And I also try to take it a step further, and then I look to see what is happening there the day that I'm there. But also, what was this place like a year before? How about 10 years before? 100 years before, 1,000 years, and then sometimes you have to go further back to try to get an understanding what the natural processes are, or perhaps human influences that have brought us to where we are today. And then try to see what lessons we've learned from that, and then try to take those lessons and apply them, hopefully to make wise decisions as we move forward in the future. So that's what I try to do. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't.
Thank you all. So I've got a second question for you. Like I'm done. Just kidding. So building on all that, I've got two questions for you. One, what do you see as the most, and it's the same question for everybody, what do you see as the most significant barriers to healthier, more resilient fish communities in the river system today? And two, where do you see the greatest opportunity to accelerate recovery if those barriers were addressed? Whatever order you.
Okay, well, I'm holding the mic, so I guess I'll go first. So, I might answer this a little bit differently than my co-panelist, because I'm gonna talk a little bit about, like you said, the barriers and maybe some solutions. So one of the big barriers we face in Friends is fragmentation on the human scale. And by that, I'm talking about barriers in policy and in the regulatory arena. There's a very complex mix of processes, agencies, quasi-agencies, state-appointed boards that you have to navigate to make changes, especially in Illinois. And then if you look nationally, every state has their own process. So when you talk about making water quality improvements or changing standards, it's a very complex mix. It's hard to navigate. It takes partnerships and resources and things that can really limit who can be involved in that. Another one is that water doesn't respect political boundaries. So water doesn't stop at Lake Cook Road and say, well, how the rules just change between Lake County and Cook County before I go into this next county. And Friends, our watershed expands over multiple counties, lots of different municipalities, multiple states. We don't have an international border, which is nice, and we don't have to deal with that, but that's the one sort of border that we're not dealing with. So a lot of the time we have to make sure Friends acts as a collaborator or a convener in those cases to make sure that we have a highest standard as we can throughout the watershed. Otherwise, you have things like road salt levels or nutrient levels that really can vary. That really, if you have high road salt conditions and nutrient conditions upstream, it doesn't really matter what the conditions downstream, they're going to get washed out. So it leads to a lot of coordination challenges. Dexter mentioned siloing. There's lots of siloing in this field. Public agencies tend to be even a little bit more siloed, I feel like. There's often a turf war over authorities and resources that Friends tries to help work out to make sure that we can move things forward as efficiently as possible. The last one I want to mention is sort of institutional and cultural memory. The Chicago River was abused and neglected for a long, long time, but it's really not anymore. And that can be reflected in the opinion or how somebody values the river by how long they've been a resident here, and how they see the river as a natural and recreational resource. If you just moved here and you bought a condo on the river, you might be surprised that it hasn't always been available for kayaking and things like that. So that's something that we deal with longtime residents. It's also something that we deal with public agencies. When I first started at Friends, one of the public agencies said the Chicago River was single use. It was designed for the conveyance of sewage effluent. And that was it. That was the single use. That was pretty short-sighted, we thought, at Friends. And we've moved much past that, but that's something that you have to deal with. One of the things I think is it's hard to change minds. Especially even if you have facts and science these days, it's hard to change minds. So it's something that happens with time and persistence. And I think that's where you start to get through some of these barriers, is working with people honestly, trying to understand where everyone's coming from and make sure you're addressing everybody. A lot of projects we work on are multiple benefit turtle nesting projects, serve many benefits besides nesting turtles. To provide space and facilitate dialogue. That's what we're doing right now. The Chicago River Summit is something like that. We've had some very innovative concepts that have come out of this that we see in the real world. Things like the Greater Chicago Watershed Alliance, the Chicago River Ecology and Governance Task Force, Lake County Stormwater Management has the North Branch Watershed Work Group and the Plains Watershed Work Group, and things like Chicago Wilderness really provide places and spaces to have that kind of dialogue. And an example of the success of this type and all this dialogue and collaboration, especially time and persistence, is the Chicago River Swim in 2025. The Chicago River Swim in 2025 is a long time coming with lots of persistence and lots of collaboration. And at the end of the day, it was a tremendous success that was recognized worldwide. And I think it really showed the city what a value the river could be.
Here, here.
So I wanted to follow up with John on some of these things. And that I think a significant barrier to the There we go. Significant barrier to biodiversity in the Chicago River, I would say, is perception. Now, perception can mean a lot of different things in a lot of different contexts, and John alluded to some of those. And an earlier speaker also mentioned perception as one. Now, I'm going to restrict my comments to fish biodiversity because we have a perception issue here as well. And what I mean by that is when you say Chicago River, Calumet River to people, they probably envision a map like this. Go, yep, it's there. Or maybe they look, see what it's downtown. However, if you talk to an aquatic ecologist and you say, what do you see up here? They will look at this and they will see a mosaic of different habitats and areas, all different. All right. And each location is very different from other locations based on a particular geology, hydrology, land use at a particular site. So to drive this point home, if you're involved in a restoration project in the headwaters of the North Branch on the top of this picture, that would be a very, very different project than if you're doing habitat restoration downtown Chicago in the middle of this picture, which in turn would be a very, very different project if you're doing that in the Calumet region down the top of this picture. All right. So you have all kinds of differences all over the place here, not just one river. Furthermore, within all these different areas, it's not just a single habitat. There's a whole suite of habitats in all of these different regions. And there are particular species of fish that like or tend to live in particular habitats. And what I'm trying to say is it's a very complex landscape here, far more so than just a river out there. Now, furthermore, there's different populations of fishes in different areas, and these populations can go up and down. That is normal. There can be natural reasons for these fluctuations, or it can be human influences. But when fish populations go down, that's not necessarily a bad thing if there's other populations nearby where individuals can come over and boost those populations back up. But that only works when you have connectivity throughout the system. So if these areas are not interconnected, if there's a lack of connectivity, that breaks down. And certain barriers, as have been mentioned, are things like dams, but it can also be pollution. It can also be lack of habitat, low oxygen, all kinds of, there's a variety of things that can act as barriers, and some fish are better at getting past these than others. So what I'm trying to say is that we have a very dynamic system out there that is constantly fluctuating. We need interconnectivity within the system. Furthermore, also I mentioned this, there was decades of abuse, and during that time a lot of species did disappear from the Chicago River. They're not going to appear magically out of nowhere. They have to come from somewhere. So that means you have to have connectivity outside the watershed as well. And one of the more obvious ones is Lake Michigan. It's right there. And there are certain species of fish that are at home more or less in Lake Michigan as well as the Chicago River, although a lot of Lake Michigan fish can be restricted to Lake Michigan. Now, in the past, several hundred years ago, there were also connections between the Chicago River and the Des Plaines River to the west. I know everybody thinks that there's a massive barrier there, but this is a flat region. If there was a huge rainstorm, a lot of flooding, and fishes had an opportunity to move back and forth. So the Des Plaines historically was a source of fish for the Chicago River. These days, there's a lot of barriers built up between the Des Plaines and the Chicago River, so it's not so easy to colonize or have fish come over and reunite that connection there. So just to keep this moving forward, because I am super interested about questions, by the way. But so I just want to wrap this up by saying that you really, if you talk about the Chicago and the Calumet River, you're really dealing with a dynamic kaleidoscope of habitats that need to be interconnected if you want a healthy and functioning system.
Well, and I think part of the barrier that I like to bring up or talk about with the river system is helping sort of with some of that connectivity. If you focus at the bottom of this map, it's all squiggly, it looks like veins and stuff. But then if you look at the main part of the river, it's a straight hallway, right? So this river was built for sewage. I would argue it was built also for conveyance of people and goods. And so a hallway kind of really helps with that. If you were to zoom in, I don't know how many people have done this. If you zoom in on Google Maps, no matter how close you get to the sanitary ship canal or North Shore Channel, it's still just a straight line. But if you were to zoom in on some of the other parts, it's squiggles back and forth. So with some of these straight lines, I'd like to start looking at creative ways that we can maybe bust down the barriers between land and water. I talked earlier that we built these barriers called riprap, which are piles of rocks, or we built barriers that are literal walls, steel walls to protect our buildings from being swallowed up by the river. But what if instead, now that we're, I don't know, in the 21st century, what if we can think of new ways to develop that shoreline? What if there's ways that we can bring back connections to areas called backwaters? So small wetlands that are connected to the river, small ponds that are connected to the river. We've seen some design ideas included in some recent designs. So if you look at the first renditions of the 78, it had a backwater area included that you could then launch a kayak from and get out on the south branch of the river. I would anticipate you'd also see turtles there, turtles spawning. You might see herons or ducks there. Boundary Park just put out a development that included a backwater area. So I think that those would be useful for people. They'd be super creative ideas. But if we take a step over to say the Des Plaines or the Fox, those existing connected backwater areas are super important ecologically. So these areas that aren't part of the main flowing channel, they tend to become a little shallow. They tend to support vegetation. They'll support algae. Since water's not flowing through them, things kind of sit there and can actually build up a food web in that area. And so we see they're super important for biodiversity of the river system. They're super productive from the standpoint of fish. Fish will spawn back there. Their babies will survive and stay back there and eat things and then go out into the river and then explore other parts of the river. What if Chicago was one of the first cities to actually start purposefully building backwater connected areas and promote biodiversity that way? What if we could change perceptions of development so that there's an actual ecological story that goes along with it, that's a positive story that brings people in. The downtown Riverwalk brings a ton of people in, a ton of tourism. What if we can start bringing people in to look at these bizarre wetlands we've built at the Bailey's Casino downtown or something like that? I think that that would be a super cool thing if I had a wand that like could change our space.
Awesome. And I definitely do want to get to Q&As for sure. I have one final question for you all. So to close out, as we think about both the progress made and the challenges ahead, what is one thing you want this audience to remember about aquatic conservation in the Chicago-Calumet River system?
Oh, I put a little twist on this one too, but I have an answer. And the answer is I'm going to go back and tell a quick story. So this event, we had a speaker a few years ago named Willie Levinson from the Human Access Project in Portland. And he told us about something called the Big No. And the Big No is this thing that you get whenever you come up with an innovative idea and you propose it to someone. Their initial reaction is no, that's a terrible idea, no. And what he made sure that we understood, and what we've done really consistently to fight, is just to fight through that. Imagine it's like your parents telling you weren't allowed to go to Lollapalooza. You have to just move past it and figure out a way to accomplish it. So ignore that big no. It's almost universal, like I said. But what you have to do is expand what people think is possible. So that's the story of what Willie did. Willie was a Portland transplant who didn't understand why he couldn't swim. Portland has Columbia River and the Willamette River. Why he couldn't swim in these rivers? He really wanted to swim in the Willamette River. So he just started doing it. And then he organized weekly swims. And then he organized this giant event called the Big Float, where he could just come and float on the river. And then at some point, during the mayoral election, one of the candidates swam their ballot across the Willamette River. And now it's gotten to the point where the Portland Park District and the Marine Fire Division are building beaches for people just to sunbathe, swim, launch kayaks, do whatever. And the city of Portland has really embraced this river as a resource for the residents. And it started off with Willie going to City Hall and getting the big no. So everything comes from that, and being able to fight through that and create attitudes that help to foster change. I think you're going to see that if you hopefully you stay today to see the Chicago River Blue Award winners, because that is what we're talking about. That is fighting through the no and doing innovative things exemplified. So that's something we want to make sure that people recognize. I was lucky enough to go accept the Tees International River Prize for Friends. one little thing, unless you stayed up to watch the live broadcast in the middle of the night, you might have missed this. When they announced the winner, they didn't say Friends of the Chicago River. What they said was the Chicago River. And that is really important, I think, to recognize that that was a prize that recognized the work of Friends, but also recognized the way that the city had embraced that work and partnered with us to push it forward. So one last slide I have here, I think exemplifies all of this. And I'm gonna give a hat tip to the photographer right over there, Amy Hellman, staff member. This is from this month, this is from January. It's a great blue heron at the former North Branch Dam site. So you see the sequence going clockwise from the top right, looking around, getting the fish, eating the fish, enjoying its lunch, and then flying on its way. And this is what we're going for. So we have all this great success that have been there when that dam was there years ago that supports all of this great stuff. And you might not believe this is in such an urban environment as the north side of the city of Chicago, but that's where this is. So that's kind of, I just want to leave it at that.
My comments are going to be relatively similar to what John just said, but in a more general sense. The Chicago River, the Calumet region has certainly faced a lot of challenges over the years, as many of you know, and they continue to face a lot of challenges. But if you've been paying attention long, there's been a lot of successes here in terms of the Chicago River, and they've been part of a lot of those. And there is definitely an upward trajectory, as what I've seen is what I'm sure many of you have seen. So there's a lot of hope for the future. Associated with challenges, sometimes there's opportunities, and if you're creative with this, you can see these opportunities. So I think Chicago is in a rather unique position because of its rather, in some ways, deplorable history of the way it treated the river. That if we can turn that around, Chicago has a chance to be literally a leader in the urban landscape and restoring aquatic ecosystems. There's a huge opportunity here to do this. You know, call it rewilding if you want, urban biology, Anthropocene ecology. I don't think a hot term, hashtag it or whatever. But there's seriously, I think Chicago's in a position where it can be a leader in restoring aquatic ecosystems and set the standard around the globe for how this could possibly be done.
I feel like you mostly took the words out of my mouth that I was going to talk about. But I wanted to, I guess, also bring up that we've seen sort of a revolution in how the river's been not only treated and operated, but the river ecosystem itself, and then how people perceive it. I think Chicago's, you won the award, so we're kind of already up there in the echelons of like rivers that are doing pretty well. I think it would be great if we could then be part of the upper of the people who are innovating and coming up with some new stuff. And are there some new creative and things that we can then put a pin in on the map for Chicago and urban restoration, especially in the aquatic realm?
Awesome, great. We've got a good amount of time actually for questions. I'm gonna water the room with the microphone. If anyone has any questions.
Hello, my name is Chris Sorge. I'm the former landscape architect at CDOT, and I have a question about oxygenization. And I thought I'd butcher that, so I'm not gonna say it again, but when I was at grad school, I had like a session with the SEPA stations that were taking water out of the river and oxygenizing it and putting it back. And like, as a designer, it was a wonderful idea to engage the public into, you know, what was going on with the river and drawing them to the river. I haven't seen anything like that happen in a long time. Is there a reason for that? Is there better ideas for getting more oxygen in the water? Or what do you guys think about?
I guess since I've played around with MWRD's data, like oxygen in the river quite a bit. Well, I guess one, those are super cool. I don't know of a whole lot of places that have side stream elevated pool aeration systems that they go. But there's also up in the North Branch, there's some ones that are like literally just powered oxygenation stations, which we're super needed back in the day. I think now, most of the time, the system doesn't really experience super low lags in oxygen, at least not for long times. Unless you look at Bubbly Creek, which is now a major discharge area during large rain events, that might see some dips in oxygen. So as far as I understand, I don't think there's much of a need for adding more of those SEPA stations or aeration stations. That's where we start talking about water quality now has kind of reached a point where it's pretty good. And now we're starting to look at habitat more. And what are some habitat variables that can bring biodiversity back? How can we maybe start varying what that landscape of the river looks like to bring in more and more varied fish species?
Yeah, that on our, to tag on, we've had, as we've reduced the amount of combined sewer overflows into the river, it's really, that's part of the reason that we don't have the need to have, where really stations are pretty cool when you go out and see people taking wedding photos at them and things, it's always interesting. But that is something that as Deep Tunnel comes fully online, 2029, that we should really see almost no CSOs, so that would hopefully, address that, except for a few places like the North Fork Channel and Bubbly Creek.
What happens with this?
I've heard some indigenous leaders talk about moving away from this perspective of managing landscapes into back to the roots of having a relationship with the landscape. And it sounds ideal. It's hard to grasp, like, how exactly would you do it? And I was struggling with it until somebody just mentioned something about maybe what we could do is, rather than putting together a management plan for landscape, how about we put a relationship plan where we put a number of things in there that mean this is the relationship we want to have with this landscape or this river, rather than this is how we want to manage. We want it to be the place where we nurture our children, where it nurtures our children, our health, and all of these other things. What I'm seeing here is probably that sort of transition. Would you say that, the community around the Chicago River is kind of moving more towards having, looking at the relationship with the river rather than managing the river? And I guess the extreme example would be like single-use, waste use river is a management, is a purely utilitarian management perspective. And what you guys have been accomplishing over the last, by you guys, I mean, probably a lot of people in this room and others, is more of a relationship with the river. And do you see yourself at some point saying, this is what we're embracing, a relationship with the river?
I really like the idea of that. I think without realizing that, that's probably what we are moving towards. And part of it is making sure that we're communicating and dialoguing with all the diverse communities that we have in the city of Chicago. We could do a lot better working with our indigenous communities than we are. We're trying to do more of that as we move forward. But it is something where we found that a healthy river, it leads to a healthy community, leads to a healthy river, leads to a healthy community, whether that's putting kayaks in or having fish or turtles or being able to go look at birds or all of those things. So that relationship is really important. I totally agree.
So when I get dragged into various restoration projects over the years, I'm usually brought in because I have a scientific background, doing research papers and all that. But some people read, some people don't, that type of thing. But I'll say hands down, the most successful restoration projects are the ones where there is a relationship with the local community, with the river. They are far and away far more successful than anything. So you can dump all the science you want in there. It does not make a successful project per se. You need that human element right there. And so when I'm on a board and they're like, they want scientific input, and I'm saying, no, you got to connect with the community somehow, whatever that community may be, if you want this project to succeed, and if they follow that advice more often than not. That's it. So I would say, yeah, we're definitely on that path, moving in that direction now. As to what that means, it can vary from area to area, from community. I'm not a scientist, so I can't say that I can speak to that per se. But yeah, no, we are moving in that direction if you just look at successful projects.
Right, we know that there's a lot of very large projects happening along, well, actually, both the North Branch and South Branch. You've got, Joe Mansueto building his, fire stadium, along the South Branch there. You've got, is it Lincoln Yards? And you've got the casino. So, how would you really managers of those large developments speak about changing the river, improving?
Yeah. So I think, when you develop a river edge property in the city of Chicago, particularly, the city of Chicago makes it pretty clear that the river is important and it needs to be considered in your design. How that, sometimes it can be tricky how the design hits the ground, and we spend a lot of time and resources and friends to make sure that happens and to involve the community in those decisions and local elected officials and river neighbors and things like that. We like to see the envelope as much as possible. So Austin mentioned the backwater that was part of the 78's initial design. I don't think that made it through, but that was one of the first times we'd seen a Chicago River beach show up. And it takes a couple for those kind of things to show up, but that's how, the envelope gets pushed. I think that's when things like with Lincoln Yards recently, where maybe it changes hands, that's where making sure that, and Brent has some very dedicated staff an eye on those things, making sure that the commitments that developers made do actually happen in the city of Chicago. And you can tell, if you take a ride through the city, you can kind of tell when properties were developed by how they treat the river. So the newer properties treat the river much more, I want to say better, but much more considerate than older properties used to.
Thank you. Talk briefly about the past tendency to armor our shorelines and how that's not particularly beneficial for aquatic life. What are some of the best practices that we're seeing now, both for shoreline restoration work, but also in stream, which I think we've seen less of in, at least in the main branch of the river. Things like creation of ripples and different depths, obviously in the backwaters that you've mentioned.
Sure, I can maybe talk about the downtown portion, because that's a lot of where I guess I spend my research time, where realistically we're not going to get them to change their shoreline much, right? Like there's only so much that the REI by the Wild Mile can do with that shoreline when their building is 2 feet from what that is. So we've been working various ways to kind of maybe push to add more habitat within the stream. Can we push on the Army Corps to allow urban rivers to put in more floating wetlands? And those floating wetlands provide all sorts of both habitat, but also ecosystem services of filtering water. So are those something we can do in that area, or other cities might need to add more aeration stations where they are downtown to help out their water quality. But I guess part of what I was sort of pushing is maybe we can't whole course remove your steel wall, but maybe you can remove 3 feet of it. And behind that, we can put a little wetland that's then connected and moves up. There's several spots along the 78 where that's certainly possible. I don't know what that soil has and what that remediation would look like. That's a different question. But is it possible to maybe become creative and start innovating on how we treat some of these shorelines further? What I know some municipalities are doing is if you have a new development and you need to do something with your shoreline because it's falling apart, they're giving you, say, tax rates or benefits of some sort to soften, whether that's putting in large riprap or even planted riprap, or if you can go and actually put in a soft shoreline, which is one that's a slow grade that's been vegetated. I don't know which developments have that money to be able to do that, but there's benefits that municipalities are doing to help soften those shorelines. Those are the common best practices I see, but I'm still just gonna push to see if we could do some other best practices in these deep areas where we can't remove the shoreline.
MWRD engaged on any of that, or the city of Chicago, because I know MWRD owns most of the shoreline, correct?
Right, but they're also, right, a lot of the shoreline is owned by MWRD. I'm not pushing them to change what they're already doing, but when we meet with the River Ecology and Governance Task Force, can we talk to those developments who have, a lot of money and are already doing something on that shoreline to maybe help promote biodiversity.
I can tack on that a little bit. Yeah. To answer that a little bit more, so we were really looking at how to do habitat and screening throughout the river system, and there's a couple projects that we're really working on right now. We're probably working on today if we weren't sitting right here. One of them is a project called the Shallow, where we looked at the riparian areas of the river, so where the bank interfaces with the stream, and what we could do to enhance that primarily with vegetation. We did a project on the Little Calumet River, some shallows, replanting projects, and on the North Shore Channel, we put in water willow and lizard's tail, and it was hugely successful. And those plants spread rhizomically through rhizomes, and they, which means you don't, if they're underwater for a while, it doesn't really matter. And there's lots of animals that could use that habitat. So we recently, this fall, we completed a project that looked at the entire river system and where are the depth conditions and the bank conditions that make sense to put more of those plants in. So now we're working with lots of partners, talk about collaborating with partners to start to do that work in the future. Part of it is getting the plant stock available. Not a lot of people are out there buying lizard's tail and water willow and stuff. So we're working really with growers across the region and really amping that up over the next 100 years. The other thing, to the MWRD's credit, a lot of that work takes place on MWRD property, almost all of it. And it's the kind of thing that's an unusual permit to go get. So when we started, we contacted them and asked them what they wanted us to do. And they said, if you're putting plants in the river, go right ahead. Go ahead and do that. Start moving dirt around and things, that's a different issue. But they're fully supportive of that. That's not their mission, but they're fully supportive of enhancing that habitat, really making the river, increasing the value of the river for everybody involved. The downtown seawall areas, we're working right now. We just did a survey with a contractor earlier this winter, late fall, to look at what the sediment conditions are like in the river channel and what the actual slope and depths of the river are down, like right downtown. So Kinsey Street, Erie, Montgomery Ward Park, all these places. And what we found, we were very pleasantly surprised with the results that we got. The water's not as deep as we thought it was going to be, and the conditions at the bottom of the water are not as soft as we thought it was going to be, which we think really puts a lot of things like adding different cobbles and things to the bottom of the river, putting places in for turtles to nest, or more vegetation right downtown in really urban environments. And that's something the city is working with us, throughout the process.
Well, I want to add to that point. You mentioned the River Ecology Task Force and the committee that looks at development comments on, I should think it's the right development proposals. John, you mentioned the very first time there was somebody thinking about doing a beach on the river. The people that took over the northern half of Lincoln Yards, the name of which is now escaping me. I'm trying to remember. But anyway, they brought to the task force, and there's through city approvals in part because they fully embraced all the river guidelines, expressed them, including the beach. They actually literally have it on there, put on the beach, which would be, if you grew up around here and you're my age, you're like, what? But it's apparently real. And the other thing worth mentioning on this point about in-stream improvement, there's several people here in the room with organizations that are part of a coalition that is hard at work on what we think will be the first two actual river re-meandering that map slide, which is in northwest Indiana, the West Branch Little River. It's barely on the map slide, but it is. It's one of the ones. And we're at a very critical stage right now, but we think we're going to get there. And that would literally be undoing some of the straight lines for the first time since, ever.
Yeah, I think one of the things developers are finding is that it's less expensive to do natural solution than it is to put up a steel seawall 6 feet above the river surface. If you're willing to sacrifice a few feet of development space for a natural stream bed for a beach, it's an innovative, more economical, and a better way to sell your development.
I've got one last question.
I'm curious about your perspectives on data centers and potential impacts on river systems in Chicago-Calumet River system area. Especially considering that some of the big tech companies are currently shopping around with living organizations to do mitigation. Data center goes in and identify, shovel-ready projects on the ground. And it's a tantalizing amount of money, millions of dollars that literally be game changers for some of these restoration projects. But is it worth it? And just kind of curious where you guys are at in the work that you do and the potential impacts of these data centers on Chicago River.
I will say that any development on the river, we're gonna take a look at data center, transportation center, or whatever. And we're gonna take a very close look at what its impact is on the river. There's lots of extra concern that comes with data centers, especially with the way that they use water and utilize water resources and whether that's a sustainable process. I think that's something that we're also very concerned with. So I don't think that we necessarily have a position in regards to data centers, like always a thumbs up or always a thumbs down. I would say we're paying very close attention to make sure that they're not going to have an impact on habitat conditions. They're not going to have an impact on water quality, local communities. Whether a data center can weave through that pinhole, I'm not sure, but it is, something that we're looking at, and there are certainly pressures, development pressures, and like you said, they bring a lot of money to the table, and that often can sort of cloud judgment, and we're part of a mission of it's not actually part of our mission, so I don't back up that. So, part of what we do as friends is really keep a close eye on that, regardless of who's going to economically benefit in the end. We want to make sure that it's the river, it's the people that live around the river, it's the creatures that are in the river, it's the existing recreational uses of the river. If the data center is going to block out access for people, that's something that we would be very concerned about.
Yeah, quick follow-up. In the various roles I served in, that question comes on more and more all the time. And I'll say the one consistent thing I can say is there are certainly a lot of opinions about it, as you can imagine, and it's local facts. So it's very hard to make an objective decision based on what the actual impacts are. A lot of people quote these numbers to you. I have people quote numbers to me all the time about all kinds of things, and half of them are through the half on. So you kind of have to sift through this once you start making these regulatory decisions. I don't think anyone really knows how to handle it right now is the honest answer. We don't have the facts right now to do that, but we have to figure this out because it is coming up. I'm going to be in Springfield, be in our headquarters next week, and I'm going to ask them what's going on about this because I need to know this for a number of things that I do too. So I'm very curious to see how DNR is handling it, at least in Illinois. I know that doesn't necessarily handle what's happening in Indiana, where I've been getting a lot of emails about going on in like Hobart, Indiana, and situations like that. But of course, different states have different regulations and different agencies. So the answer is, I don't think anyone really knows what to do yet. There's a lot of ideas. We need to get better facts, and we need to get ahead of this. I think as the conservation community mind right now, we need to get ahead of it.
Well, I would just offer an idea in climate region, we formed a working communities to start to regularly sit through what we know, what we don't know, and where they'll all have organization and as a community, I'm hopeful that there's something like that bubbling up, maybe not on the free.
Amazing. Thank you, everybody, for your really thoughtful questions. And thank you, Bill, John, and Austin, for sharing your time and your expertise today.